Across the Korean peninsula, there are places where time seems to slow, as if the air itself remembers something older than memory. Fields roll gently toward distant hills. Forests breathe in long shadows, and on quiet ridges where the wind moves without sound, enormous stones rest as though they arrived long before the people who now walk beside them. They sit in rows, clusters, and solitary silhouettes, scattered so widely and in such staggering numbers that the land begins to feel less like a landscape and more like a vast open-air archive. Long before cities rose, before kingdoms fought, before the peninsula carried the names it has today, these stones were already here, watching the centuries drift past like passing clouds. They do not demand attention. They do not glitter, tower, or boast. They simply exist with an unsettling confidence, as if certain that their purpose has not been forgotten by the world, only misplaced by those who came later. Many visitors describe a faint pressure in the air around them, a quiet insistence that something important happened here. Others sense an odd familiarity, as though the stones were not strangers, but ancient hosts welcoming anyone willing to listen. And perhaps that is why they unsettle us. They stand not as ruins but as presences, unbroken and unapologetically intact, even after thousands of years. What makes this landscape even more unusual is not just the size of the stones, but their overwhelming abundance. Although Europe is often imagined as the heartland of megalithic culture, it is Korea that holds the greatest concentration on Earth. More than 30,000 dolmens lie scattered across the peninsula, far more than the famous fields of France, the windswept coasts of Ireland, or the chalk plains surrounding Stonehenge. The contrast feels almost unreal. How could a place smaller than many European countries hold such a monumental share of the world's prehistoric architecture? How did a land described as remote by ancient chroniclers become the quiet capital of megaliths? The stones offer no explanation. Their surfaces are worn smooth by rain and thaw, their shapes softened by centuries of drifting soil. Yet each one seems placed with intention, balanced on smaller supports, aligned to distant peaks, tilted in subtle patterns that resist accident. Even without understanding their purpose, one senses design. One senses that those who placed them here saw the world differently, and measured meaning not in written marks but in weight, effort, and unbroken endurance. Across cultures, stone has always carried symbolic gravity. It is the material chosen for memory when everything else fades. It anchors stories, marks boundaries, protects the dead, guides the living, and reaches toward whatever the sky might hold. But in Korea, this ancient instinct seems amplified. The sheer number of megaliths gives the impression of a society that communicated through stone the way others once did through myth. Each dolmen feels like a sentence in a language we have forgotten how to read. Together they form a quiet chorus, repeating something the builders believed must never vanish. As twilight settles along the peninsula, the stones change character. Their silhouettes grow sharper while the horizon blurs. Birds retreat into the trees, and the low rustle of grasses begins to echo faintly between the capstones. In this light, the dolmens feel less like relics and more like doorways, thresholds between the world we know and the world that shaped it. Something in the calmness invites lingering questions, the kind that slip gently into the mind and refuse to leave. And that is where the true mystery begins. These stones are everywhere, standing in fields, mountains, forests, and empty clearings. If so many were needed, and so many were built, then the builders themselves must have lived everywhere as well. Their hands shaped a peninsula into a mosaic of stone. Their choices continue to shape how the land feels even now. Which leads to the question that quietly rises the longer one looks. Who placed these stones here and when? At first glance, the megalithic fields of Korea feel unusual, but not impossible. A row of stones here, a cluster there, perhaps the work of a small community honouring its dead. But as one moves across the peninsula, a strange realization begins to take shape. The stones do not thin out, they multiply. Hills, plains, riverbanks, agricultural fields, and even the edges of modern towns reveal more capstones resting on silent supports. What begins as curiosity hardens into disbelief, because the further you travel, the more the land seems determined to reveal something that statistics alone cannot carry. Korea does not merely have a few megaliths, it holds the majority of the world's. More than 35,000 dolmens have been recorded so far, and new ones continue to surface whenever the earth is cut open for roads or foundations. The number grows not by dozens, but by hundreds each year, as though the peninsula keeps remembering fragments of a story it once buried. By contrast, the whole of Europe, the continent associated with ancient stones, the home of Stonehenge and Karnak, and the windswept chambers of the Atlantic coast, holds far fewer. Nothing in the landscape of tradition or popular imagination prepares the viewer for this reversal. The places we thought were merely footnotes become the central chapters, and the places we assumed to be the heart of prehistoric culture become supporting details. Such an imbalance feels like it should be impossible. Korea's prehistoric population was never enormous. Its early communities were scattered, seasonal, and dependent on the rhythms of rivers and mountains. Yet these people produced more megalithic structures than regions with populations many times larger. The stones appear at a density that breaks familiar patterns. Instead of grand monuments separated by long distances, Korea offers small and large dolmens, placed with a regularity that resembles a natural phenomenon, like trees in a forest that has grown for thousands of years. But unlike forests, these stones did not grow. They were carried, lifted, shaped, arranged, and aligned. Each one required effort on a scale that should have limited their number. Somehow, that limitation did not apply here. For generations, however, the world looked elsewhere. Europe's stones received myths, paintings, expeditions, and entire academic traditions. The Korean peninsula, distant from the centers of Western scholarship, was rarely included in the early narratives of human prehistory. Its monuments remained quiet, overshadowed not by a lack of importance but by a lack of attention. Even today, many travelers arrive in Korea without knowing that they are stepping onto the greatest megalithic landscape on Earth. They imagine temples, markets, neon cities, and mountain trails, but not an ancient world of stone spread beneath their feet. And so the numbers feel unreal, as though they belong to a place that should exist only in theory. Why would a relatively modest population create tens of thousands of monumental structures? Why would a tradition demanding such immense coordination persist for centuries? And why do so few people outside the peninsula know any of this? The more one studies the figures, the more they behave not like data but like riddles. A small land produces the greatest stones. A quieter culture leaves the loudest trace. A forgotten population shapes one of the ancient world's largest architectural traditions. This imbalance forces a reconsideration of the past. Scholars once assumed that monumental architecture grew only in societies with strong hierarchies, abundant resources, and centralized authority. Yet the Korean dolmens challenge this logic, hinting at cultures that operated with different forms of organization, cooperative, ritualistic, and anchored in shared cosmology rather than political command. The numbers whisper that there was more here than simple burial practices or scattered tribal customs. They hint at networks of villages linked by belief, at seasonal gatherings where entire communities lifted stones together, at knowledge systems not preserved in writing but etched into the land itself. As these thoughts settle, the view of the peninsula begins to shift. What once appeared as isolated structures becomes evidence of an overlooked civilization. The stones reveal a landscape shaped not by chance but by intention, repetition, and memory. They suggest that early Korean societies understood something about permanence that later cultures forgot, that to be remembered, one does not need walls, cities, or written words. One needs endurance, weight, and patience. And yet, with all these numbers, one question remains untouched. If so many stones were built, and so many builders must have lived, then the origins of this tradition should be obvious. But they are not. The deeper one looks, the more the timeline blurs. Dates shift. Meanings dissolve. The stones keep their silence. This numerical puzzle does not end the mystery. It opens it wider, leading gently toward the next question. How old are these monuments, and why does their story begin in shadows rather than certainty? When we try to understand the dolmens of Korea, the first question seems simple. How old are they? Yet this question becomes a doorway into a deeper uncertainty, because unlike palaces, temples, or fortresses, these stones carry no inscriptions. No chiseled names, no declarations of purpose, no dates etched into their surfaces. They stand in complete silence, offering only their presence as evidence. And so archaeologists must approach them like shadows left on the earth, traces that speak indirectly through soil, fragments, and the faint echoes of rituals now lost. Most scholars place the origins of Korea's megalithic tradition in the early Bronze Age, around 1,000 years before the beginning of the Common Era. But this date is not a firm anchor. It is more like a soft outline drawn around possibilities. Beneath certain dolmens, layers of soil reveal pottery shards belonging to even earlier cultures. In other cases, pollen analysis suggests that the land around these structures was already shaped by human hands long before the estimated construction dates. The stones sit atop evidence that stretches backward in time, hinting that the tradition may have begun generations before the earliest recognizable markers. Dating becomes an exercise in quiet interpretation. A single piece of pottery might shift a timeline by centuries. A burial chamber containing bronze tools might suggest one era, while the orientation of the dolmen itself hints at an older ritual logic. The builders left no written record to confirm or deny these clues. They did not carve their names or their lineage into stone, perhaps because they believed the monument itself was the message, and the identity of the hands that raised it was irrelevant to the purpose it served. In this way, the dolmens resist being pinned to a specific century. They drift across time like islands in mist. This ambiguity creates a strange effect. Instead of feeling distant, the stones feel strangely present, as if they belong to a timeline not bound to strict dates but to the enduring rhythms of the land. Their age becomes something the viewer senses rather than knows. Standing before them, one feels the weight of thousands of years, yet the exact count remains elusive. This uncertainty does not diminish the stones, it deepens them. They become relics not just of a prehistoric world, but of a prehistoric way of thinking, one that left no need for documentation. And so the question of age becomes more than a technical matter. It becomes part of the narrative tension. If the dolmens began earlier than we assume, then their builders lived in a world even more primitive than current estimates suggest. A world without metal tools, without developed agriculture, without organized states, yet these early communities somehow managed to raise stones weighing tens of tons. If the dolmens are later than assumed, that opens a different mystery. Why would societies already transitioning into complex political structures cling to a megalithic tradition long after such customs faded elsewhere? The stones seem to hover between eras, refusing to settle into any single moment. There is something haunting in the idea that such massive structures can exist without clear origin stories. We are accustomed to civilizations announcing themselves loudly through writing, art, and monuments that declare their rulers. But here, an entire architectural tradition rises without attribution. The builders remain nameless, faceless, and unrecorded. Their culture shaped the land with enormous effort, yet left no written explanation of what that effort meant. The dolmens feel less like monuments of individuals, and more like expressions of a worldview that believed meaning was carried in action, not inscription. This absence of names forces us to engage differently with the past. Instead of reading history through texts, we must read it through weight, alignment, repetition, and silence. The stones become the closest thing to voices these early people left behind. Yet even those voices speak in a language we no longer understand. We can measure the age of a burial chamber, but we cannot measure the thoughts of the people who opened the earth to place it there. We can date the soil around a capstone, but not the belief that inspired its impossible ascent. And so the real mystery begins to shift. The question is not simply when the dolmens were built, but why such a monumental effort became the defining rhythm of life for centuries. The age tells us when hands shaped the earth, but not what compelled them. The identity of the builders remains a shadow, waiting at the threshold of recorded history. This quiet uncertainty leads naturally to the next step. If the stones cannot tell us their exact age, then perhaps they can tell us something about the people who raised them. And so, the story moves forward, toward the elusive civilizations that shaped a landscape of stone. When we try to imagine the people who built the dolmens of Korea, our minds instinctively reach for familiar images: chieftains directing workers, armies of laborers hauling stones, settlements ruled by emerging kings. Yet the evidence suggests something far more delicate and elusive. These builders did not leave behind palaces or fortresses. They did not carve their thoughts into walls or seal their histories in tablets of clay. Their world existed before written language took hold, before states formed rigid boundaries, before rulers turned memory into monuments of self. And so, the civilization that shaped the stones remains suspended between presence and absence, visible in the landscape, invisible in the record. Archaeological clues paint a picture that is surprisingly soft. These were small communities, often semi-nomadic, moving with the seasons, fishing along coasts, cultivating early crops, gathering in clusters around river valleys. Their houses were modest, their tools simple, their graves scattered across open earth. Nothing about them suggests the capacity to organize vast construction projects. Yet that is exactly what they did. Across the peninsula, they raised tens of thousands of megaliths, each requiring planning, cooperation, and a unity of purpose that defies the image of isolated village life. The paradox becomes part of their identity. How could small groups accomplish something that larger civilizations struggled to achieve? The answer may lie in the structure of their belief systems. These were not primitive people stumbling through survival. They were societies woven together by ritual, kinship, and shared cosmology. Their gatherings were not merely practical events, but moments of reaffirmation, opportunities to renew bonds through acts that shaped the land itself. When a dolmen was raised, it was not only a burial, it was a statement of belonging, a physical anchor that tied communities to the world around them and to each other. In this way, their monuments were not separate from everyday life. They were the architecture of identity. The people did not need written language because they inscribed their beliefs into stone. Each capstone, each supporting slab, each burial chamber became part of a silent script spread across hills and valleys. The stones preserved the memory of a civilization that chose endurance over inscription, presence over proclamation. And because of this choice, the builders became the rarest kind of ancient culture, one remembered through effort rather than narrative. Their disappearance from the historical record is not evidence of their insignificance. It is evidence of how thoroughly the later world overwrote the earlier one. As kingdoms formed and writing systems emerged, these quiet communities faded, their ways absorbed into new social structures. But the stones remained, untouched by shifting dynasties, unaffected by political ambition. They became the only surviving witnesses of the people who shaped them. Without names, without recorded stories, without leaders whose tombs reveal their rank, these builders persist as shadows cast across terrain. And yet, the more we study their work, the more sophisticated they appear. Their knowledge of balance, leverage, and terrain suggests a deep familiarity with the land. Their ability to coordinate labor across multiple groups implies alliances or shared rituals that extended far beyond individual villages. Their variation in dolmen styles hints at cultural diversity, while their uniformity of purpose reveals a common thread binding them together. They were not an anonymous mass, but a civilization of many voices speaking one architectural language. To call them forgotten is not quite accurate. They are remembered through what they created, even if their individual stories dissolved long ago. Their identity lives within the stones the way a melody lives within a single note felt, not written, known, not named. When we walk among the dolmens, we walk through the remains of a civilization that deliberately chose simplicity in life and permanence in death. A culture that embraced the quiet power of stone to carry memory forward without needing to leave its name behind. They remind us that not all civilizations announce themselves with monuments of grandeur or texts of authority. Some express their genius through endurance and ritual, through structures humble in form, but vast in number. In this light, the builders of Korea's dolmens become one of the most intriguing ancient societies on Earth. A civilization that shaped its world through cooperation rather than domination, through shared belief rather than centralized rule. And this understanding leads naturally to the next question. If these nameless builders possessed such quiet sophistication, how exactly did they move the stones that define their legacy? The answer lies in the techniques they developed, the tools they crafted, and the knowledge they carried, details that begin to emerge in the next section. The first time one stands beside a Korean dolmen, the scale feels almost unreasonable. A single capstone can weigh as much as a small house, yet it balances on supporting stones with a precision that suggests both patience and intimate familiarity with the land. What makes this all the more astonishing is that the people who built these structures worked without the iron tools later civilizations took for granted. They shaped and moved their stones with implements of rock, bone, and early bronze materials that seem far too delicate for the task. And yet, somehow, the stones moved. Archaeologists imagine scenes that stretch the limits of what we consider possible for small prehistoric communities. Logs stripped of branches and smoothed by repeated use may have served as rollers. Thick cords woven from plant fibers could have been used to pull the stones into motion. Sledges fashioned from timber might have offered a stable base for dragging the weight across damp soil. Even with these tools, the effort required would have been immense, demanding not only physical strength, but coordination on a scale that transforms simple labor into something closer to ritual. The process might have unfolded slowly, with dozens of people walking in unison, chanting or calling out to maintain rhythm as the stone inched forward. Others guided the path, clearing obstacles, adjusting rollers, preparing the ground. Still others stood atop ridges, signaling with smoke or gesture, directing the massive procession toward a chosen destination. These scenes, though imagined, align with the traces left in the earth, marks of movement, paths smoothed by repeated hauling, the absence of quarry debris near some dolmen fields suggesting stones were transported from far away. Yet even with these theories, the mystery remains intact. Some dolmens sit on steep ridges where no simple path exists. Others perch on slopes that would require elaborate ramps or terraces, structures for which no physical evidence survives. The builders not only moved stones, they lifted them, angled them, and arranged them with a precision that defies the modest technological footprint they left behind. How they achieved this remains partly unknowable. Stone tools can chip away rock, but shaping a capstone large enough to overshadow a modern truck without leaving clear shaping marks raises questions scholars still debate. We search for engineering diagrams, for carved instructions, for remnants of scaffolding. None appear. The builders left behind no sketches, no step-by-step guides, no hints written in clay or bone. All we have are the results, and the results suggest a level of organization that does not match the common assumptions about early Bronze Age life. It is as if their knowledge flowed through action rather than documentation, carried in memory, repetition, and shared experience. The landscape became their instruction manual, the stone their testament. Some researchers propose that understanding terrain was the builders' greatest advantage. They may have moved stones when the ground was frozen, using winter's hardness as a natural support. They may have navigated seasonal streams to float or slide stones along mud-lubricated paths. They may have exploited gravity, rolling stones downhill before hauling them upward with coordinated force. These ideas do not simplify the feat, but they remind us that ancient people saw the world differently, noticing patterns and opportunities modern eyes overlook. And perhaps this is the heart of the puzzle. The builders were not engineers in the later formal sense. They were observers of the land, attuned to subtle shifts in weather, soil, and slope. Their tools were basic, but their understanding of how the world behaved was profound. They recognized that a single stone had its own temperament, how it resisted, how it yielded, how it wanted to move. They worked with these tendencies rather than against them, turning apparent limitations into advantages. Yet even as we piece together fragments of their method, a sense of awe persists. Moving such massive objects required more than technique. It required purpose strong enough to unite communities, motivate long days of labor, and justify the risks of handling stones capable of crushing entire teams. And that purpose remains far less clear than the methods. Which leads the story toward its next question. If the builders possessed such determination and coordination, then what compelled them to invest so much effort into shaping their world of stone? The answer lies not in the tools they used, but in the beliefs that guided their hands, a mystery that begins to surface in the next chapter. When we look at the dolmens scattered across Korea, the instinct is to search for a single explanation, a reason strong enough to justify the staggering effort behind their creation. But purpose, in the ancient world, was rarely simple. These stones belong to a time when ritual, life, death, and landscape intertwined in ways modern minds struggle to separate. The builders did not leave inscriptions to guide our interpretations. They left forms, alignments, and silent clues that whisper possibilities without confirming any of them. One of the clearest signs of meaning lies in burial customs. Many dolmens contain human remains, suggesting that at least part of their purpose was funerary. But even this explanation opens more questions than it resolves. Why would communities dedicate such immense labor to marking a single grave? And why create so many of them, across plains, ridges, and coastlines, as though every corner of the land required its own monument? These were not isolated tombs, but a landscape-wide expression of memory, built with far greater scale and persistence than most ancient societies ever attempted. The presence of grave goods, bronze knives, beads, pottery hints at beliefs about the afterlife, suggesting that the dead required objects for a journey beyond this world. Yet the dolmens themselves feel too large for burial alone. They face specific mountain peaks, align with seasonal sunrise points, or cluster along routes that likely served as boundaries or meeting places. Their placement suggests an intention that extends beyond honoring individuals. They mark space, they define belonging. They shape the land into something symbolically alive. Early shamanistic beliefs provide another thread of interpretation. In many ancient Northeast Asian cultures, stones served as anchors for spirits, thresholds between visible and invisible realms. A dolmen might have been a place where ancestors were called, where guidance was sought, where rituals shaped communal identity. If the builders believed the world was animated by unseen forces, then raising stones may have been a way of conversing with those forces, of making the intangible tangible. In that context, moving a giant stone across a valley was not simply labor, it was devotion. Territorial meaning offers another layer. A dolmen positioned on a hill or ridge may have signaled control over fertile land or safe passage. But here too, the puzzle deepens. Territorial markers are usually few and strategic. Korean dolmens number in the tens of thousands, and appear in locations that would not require political declarations. This suggests a logic different from modern boundaries, one that expressed relationship to land rather than ownership of it. These stones may have been part of a cultural language that tied communities together, reminding them of shared ancestry or collective ritual obligations. Cosmic symbolism also emerges in certain patterns. Some dolmens appear aligned with solstice events or constellations significant in ancient Northeast Asian cosmology. Whether this was intentional or coincidental, the effect is the same. The viewer senses a people who responded not only to the earth beneath their feet, but to the sky above their heads. In this interpretation, the dolmens become instruments of orientation, anchors that stitched human life to celestial rhythms. A stone could be both a grave and a compass, a remembrance and a measurement. What makes Korea's dolmens especially intriguing is how different they are from those of Europe or the Middle East. European megaliths often function as astronomical observatories or ceremonial centers. Middle Eastern structures tend to align with trade routes or religious complexes. Korea's dolmens, by contrast, form a dense constellation of monuments that appear both deeply personal and profoundly collective. They do not ritualize a single site, they ritualize an entire peninsula. And so, the real question emerges. What belief was powerful enough to compel countless communities to lift stones across centuries? We cannot point to a single answer, but the emotional truth rises gently from the landscape itself. These people built not only for the dead, but for the living, and for those who would come after. Each dolmen stands like a hand placed on the shoulder of time, reminding anyone who passes that memory is not a thing to be spoken, but a thing to be carried. As this thought settles, the narrative shifts. If the purpose of the stones cannot be reduced to one meaning, perhaps their placement contains its own message. And so we step into the next chapter, where patterns emerge, patterns that might hold the key to understanding the builder's deepest intentions. At first, the dolmens appear scattered, as if placed wherever the land offered a flat surface or a convenient rise. But the longer one studies the peninsula from above through satellite imagery, archaeological surveys, and the slow accumulation of field notes, a different truth begins to surface. The stones are not random, they form patterns. Long lines across valleys, gentle arcs tracing old rivers, clusters arranged like constellations. Some are spread so evenly that the land looks marked, as though someone long ago traced invisible paths beneath the soil and anchored them with stone. Archaeologists notice this only after mapping thousands of sites. A single dolmen might seem isolated, but when placed on a larger map, it becomes part of something larger, something unexpected. Along certain coastlines, the dolmens appear in rhythmic intervals, following ancient shorelines now altered by centuries of tide. Far inland, they stretch along mountain passes that once served as natural corridors between communities. Others form geometric arrangements, diamond-shaped clusters on plateaus, parallel lines along gentle slopes, or pairs of stones guarding narrow ridges like silent sentinels. It is in these patterns that the land begins to speak. One repeated motif is the valley line. In numerous regions, capstones lie in long, curving rows that mimic the flow of rivers. These are not burial clusters shaped by chance. They appear as deliberate echoes of the water below. Perhaps they marked seasonal migrations, tracing the routes of fishers or foragers, or perhaps they signaled the boundaries of a community's shared territory, stretching across land the way a thread binds fabric. Whatever the reason, these repeated arrangements suggest an understanding of geography that went far beyond simple settlement. On coastal plains, another pattern emerges. Dolmens gather near former estuaries, not as tight clusters but as wide belts, as if marking the edge of a world where land met sea. The spacing is too regular to dismiss, hinting at a ritual shoreline, a place where travellers arrived, where trade began, or where the first ceremonies of a season unfolded. Some scholars imagine lines of people walking these ancient borders, guided by stones rather than signposts, each monument serving as both marker and reminder. Then there are the stones placed on thresholds, a single dolmen perched at the mouth of a valley, or a pair aligning perfectly with a distant peak. These do not function like ordinary burial sites. They feel like declarations, or perhaps invitations, signaling that one has entered a space held sacred or significant. The interpretation varies, but the sensation does not. Standing before such a stone, one feels the distinct impression of being watched by the landscape itself. The most intriguing patterns of all appear not as lines or clusters, but as echoes across regions, motifs repeated by communities separated by mountains, rivers, and vast stretches of time. A particular arrangement found in the southwest appears again hundreds of kilometers to the northeast, suggesting communication or shared tradition. How such coordination occurred remains unclear. These were small, mobile groups without writing, yet they expressed a unified spatial logic across the entire peninsula. It is as though they all carried the same map in their minds, drawn not on clay tablets, but in memory and ritual. To call these patterns accidental would be to underestimate the builders profoundly. The dolmens reflect choices where to place a stone, how to face it, what landscapes to honor. They form what scholars sometimes describe as a geographic memory system, a way of inscribing identity into the earth without words. When viewed this way, the peninsula transforms into a vast, prehistoric manuscript. Valleys become sentences, clusters become symbols, solitary stones become punctuation marks that once guided footsteps through a world now vanished. What the map represents remains uncertain. It could mirror the routes of migration that early communities followed with the seasons. It could encode the boundaries between clans or ritual territories. It might even chart spiritual pathways lines along which ancestors were believed to travel, linking the living to the dead through the land itself. Each possibility opens a different window into the worldview of the builders, reminding us that meaning was not just placed in the stones but stretched between them. And as one contemplates these patterns, a new question begins to rise. If the stones reflect the land so carefully, could they also reflect the sky? After all, many ancient cultures oriented their monuments not only by earth but by moon and sun, by the slow turning of constellations overhead. The dolmen's patterns on the ground hint at rhythms deeper than geography alone. This quiet possibility leads naturally to the next step, the exploration of whether these stones might also align with the heavens above. As the patterns of dolmens across the land begin to reveal themselves, another layer of meaning quietly rises above them, one that does not root itself in the soil but in the sky. While Korean megaliths rarely display the dramatic astronomical alignments found at places like Stonehenge or Newgrange, subtle clues suggest that the builders were watching more than the ground beneath their feet. They were watching the heavens, and in their own quiet way, they allowed the sky to shape the earth. Some dolmens face particular points on the horizon, where the sun emerges during solstice dawns. These orientations are not striking at first glance. They do not form stone corridors guiding light into chambers. Instead, a capstone may tilt ever so slightly toward a sunrise point, or a burial chamber may open toward the place where the first light appears on the longest day of the year. These gestures are soft, almost shy, as if the builders acknowledge celestial rhythms without seeking to control them. Yet the precision of these choices hints at a worldview that regarded the heavens not as distant abstractions, but as living forces woven into the rhythm of life. In certain regions, clusters of dolmens align along trajectories connected to seasonal stars that held significance in early Northeast Asian cosmology. Ancient observers would have recognized these stars, rising at specific times of the year, announcing changes in weather, harvest cycles, or ritual calendars. It is possible that dolmens served as subtle markers of these transitions, helping communities keep time in an era before written calendars or precise instruments. The stones may have acted as reminders, silent nods toward the slow turning of the celestial wheel. This perspective becomes more compelling when one considers how deeply prehistoric societies depended on predictable cycles. The movement of the sun and stars guided fishing seasons, agricultural decisions, and ceremonial gatherings. A slight shift in the sky could signal abundance or hardship, renewal or caution. Aligning stones with these signals would have been a way of grounding cosmic rhythms into the physical world, creating fixed points against which change could be measured. A dolmen could become not just a burial site, but a seasonal landmark, a place where the heavens touch the earth. Yet the alignments are never absolute. They do not prescribe a single cosmic blueprint. Instead, they resemble scattered hints, like notes left by someone who trusted the land and sky to reveal the full message naturally. This ambiguity preserves the mystery. The builders seem to have understood the sky intimately, but not in a way that demands grand monuments or precise astronomical calculations. Their relationship with the heavens was quieter, more integrated, more personal. It flowed through their lives and into their architecture, without shouting its presence. Picture an ancient community gathered at twilight as stars emerge above a newly raised dolmen. The capstone still bears the marks of the tools that shaped it, the earth around it fresh from digging. Someone points toward the horizon, where a particular star rises, and the group nods, recognizing the moment not as spectacle, but as ritual continuity. Their ancestors watched these same stars. Their descendants will do the same. The dolmen becomes part of that continuity, a fixed reminder in a shifting world. This subtlety sets Korean dolmens apart from other megalithic traditions. The alignments do not suggest a single ritual center or a unified astronomical calendar. Instead, they hint at regional practices, localized interpretations of the sky, and a worldview that allowed communities to express shared ideas through varied forms. The builders did not impose the heavens onto the land, they harmonized with them. As these patterns of orientation accumulate, they become impossible to dismiss. The stones bridge earth and sky without demanding recognition, embodying a cosmic awareness that feels both modest and profound. They remind us that ancient people saw the world as layered physical, spiritual, celestial, and that each layer shaped the others in ways we are only beginning to sense. With the land mapped and the sky acknowledged, a new question emerges. If the builders responded to both terrain and heaven, then the forms of the dolmens themselves must hold meaning as well. And so the story turns toward the structures they created and the mysteries hidden in their variations. Across the Korean peninsula, the dolmens share a common presence, but not a common shape. At first glance, the stones seem unified, a single tradition carried across generations. But as archaeologists studied them more closely, they realized that these monuments fall into three distinct architectural forms. Each form carries its own logic, its own rhythm, its own quiet voice, and together, they create a puzzle far more intricate than anyone expected. The earliest and most imposing are the northern-style dolmens, found primarily in the upper regions of the peninsula. These structures lift massive capstones high above the ground, supported by upright slabs that create tall, table-like forms. Some stand so boldly on slopes and ridges that they seem less like tombs and more like beacons, signaling across valleys. Their scale is astonishing. Multi-ton capstones balanced on narrow supports, commanding the landscape with a confidence that suggests ritual authority. These early structures feel ceremonial, almost theatrical, as though the builders intended them to be seen from afar. Far to the south, a different style emerges. Here, the dolmens lie closer to the earth, forming box-like chambers with broad capstones that rest directly atop side stones. They appear more compact, more sheltered, as if their purpose shifted from being seen to being protected. The internal chambers are carefully constructed, suggesting an increasing emphasis on burial customs and the private world of ancestors. These go-table dolmens do not reach toward the sky. They fold inward, drawing attention to what lies within rather than what stands above. Between these two extremes lies a hybrid form, scattered across central regions. These dolmens blend characteristics of both the northern and southern styles. Capstones raised slightly above ground, chambers neither fully enclosed nor entirely exposed. Chronologically, they bridge the gap between early monumentalism and later intimate ritual. Their existence hints at a cultural conversation unfolding across centuries, ideas traveling, merging, transforming, as communities exchanged beliefs and adapted old traditions to new realities. The presence of these three designs prompts questions that ripple through the archaeological record. Why would one megalithic tradition express itself in such different ways? Did distinct groups converge on the peninsula, each bringing their own architectural language? Or did a single culture evolve over generations, experimenting with new forms as population density, social hierarchy, or spiritual priorities shifted? The stones offer no written answers, but their shapes reveal a lineage of thought, a progression in how the builders understood memory, death, and sacred space. As one walks among these dolmens, the contrasts feel almost deliberate. A northern-style structure towers overhead, its capstone tilted toward a ridge lined with ancient pines. Nearby, a southern-style chamber sits low, half-buried, as if returning to the earth. The hybrid stones, neither high nor low, linger like transitional whispers monuments from a moment when the culture balanced between two worlds. Each form feels like a different chapter in a story written without words. The variation also challenges the idea that prehistoric societies were static. Instead, the dolmens reveal dynamism. They show adaptation, experimentation, and an evolving sense of meaning. Perhaps early communities valued visibility and grandeur, raising stones that allowed ancestors to watch over entire landscapes. Later generations may have turned inward, seeking connection through enclosed chambers, private spaces where the boundary between living and dead thinned. Over time, one form faded as another flourished, mirroring the natural shifts of belief and identity. Yet the variations could reflect diversity rather than change. Multiple groups may have coexisted, intermingling, trading, celebrating shared rituals, while maintaining distinct architectural preferences. Each group expresses its worldview through stone, but all contribute to a wider megalithic tradition that spans the peninsula. In this interpretation, the dolmens become evidence of a cultural mosaic, not a single lineage. Whichever path we imagine, the mystery remains compelling. Three designs born from one tradition, three expressions of belief shaped by different landscapes, different priorities, perhaps even different interpretations of the afterlife. The stones silently preserve these differences, their forms hinting at stories that lived among the builders long before history learned to write them down. As these possibilities linger, a deeper question begins to rise. Where did this tradition begin, and how did it spread across the peninsula with such unity and variation at the same time? To trace that origin, the story now turns toward the early movements of people, ideas, and rituals into the search for the first builders who shaped this world of stone. To understand the dolmens of Korea, one must look not only at the stones themselves, but at the wider world from which they may have emerged. Across Northeast Asia, megaliths appear like scattered footprints. Dolmens in Manchuria, isolated capstones in Primorye, stone chambers in the river valleys of northern China. These remnants suggest movement, exchange, and memory stretching across vast regions. And yet, despite this broad distribution, the oldest and most commanding megaliths cluster not in the continental heartland, but on the Korean peninsula, a place once described as the end of the land, a remote frontier facing the open sea. This unexpected concentration raises a question scholars have debated for decades. Did the megalithic tradition begin here, or did it arrive from elsewhere, carried by migrating groups who followed river corridors and coastal routes before settling in Korea and transforming their inherited rituals into something monumental? Archaeologists trace pottery styles, burial customs, and tool types to reconstruct this ancient web of connections. Some similarities emerge: shared ceramics, comparable stone tools, overlapping burial practices. But the picture remains too complex to resolve with simple lines on a map. The oldest Korean dolmens, especially the towering northern-style structures, have no exact parallels in nearby regions. Dolmens in Manchuria and Primorye exist, but they are fewer, smaller, and less varied. In northern China, stone burials appear, yet their forms diverge sharply from the peninsula's broad capstones and monumental construction. The Korean dolmens stand apart both in scale and in creative experimentation. If the tradition arrived from outside, something in Korea transformed it dramatically. If it arose independently, the scale of invention is extraordinary for societies without writing or centralized states. One theory imagines early Bronze Age groups moving slowly along river systems that spill into the Yellow Sea, carrying with them stories and rituals. As these groups reached the peninsula, they found landscapes that echoed the symbolic geographies they already revered: mountains rising in sacred shapes, river mouths that felt like thresholds between worlds. Here, the megalithic tradition may have taken root and expanded in ways it never did elsewhere, shaped by local beliefs that magnified the importance of stone. In this view, Korea was not the origin, but the amplification point, the place where old ideas found fertile ground. Another theory suggests independent invention. The peninsula's early cultures already practiced ancestor worship, seasonal rituals, and landscape veneration. The rise of dolmens may have emerged naturally from evolving spiritual needs. Rather than borrowing from neighbors, early Koreans may have drawn inspiration from the land itself, its granite mountains, its fractured cliffs, its wide river plains. Stone was abundant, durable, and symbolically loaded. The megalithic impulse may have been less about external influence and more about internal awakening, a culture realizing that memory could be made permanent by shaping the earth. A third possibility involves cultural diffusion from civilizations now vanished or little understood. Archaeologists occasionally unearth fragments, pottery, beads, or tools that hint at networks spanning farther than expected. These clues suggest contact with early societies whose identities are now lost. Perhaps the megalithic tradition moved through these forgotten corridors, carried by waves of migration long erased by time. The traces of such networks exist like faint constellations dots that do not fully connect but hint at patterns we no longer recognize. Regardless of which explanation one prefers, the emotional truth remains the same. The dolmens of Korea cannot be dismissed as mere copies or imitations. They are part of a broader Northeast Asian tapestry, but they occupy a central, transformative place within it. Something about the peninsula, its geography, its early cultures, its spiritual imagination, took the megalithic impulse and magnified it into a cultural identity. The stones here are not simply variations on foreign ideas, they are expressions of a worldview deeply rooted in Korean soil. Standing among these ancient monuments, one feels this rootedness directly. The stones seem to rise from the land rather than sit upon it, as though they grew from the earth's memory. Each dolmen carries traces of distant connections, yet its form feels uniquely shaped by this peninsula's contours and rhythms. The builders were part of a wider world, but they were also unmistakably themselves. As the search for origins unfolds, another question begins to take shape, not where the tradition came from, but how it changed over time. If the first builders laid the foundation, later generations reshaped that foundation in ways that reveal shifting beliefs and evolving identities. And so the story moves forward toward the long arc of transformation that defines the megalithic tradition across the centuries. When the earliest dolmens rose across the Korean landscape, they were grand and imposing, massive capstones lifted high above the earth, supported by upright stones that transformed valleys and ridges into ceremonial landmarks. These early monuments radiate a sense of exclusivity, as though they were meant for leaders, revered figures, or ancestors whose memory demanded scale. They stand apart, commanding attention even after thousands of years. But as centuries passed, something subtle and profound began to shift. The stones changed. They grew smaller. They spread farther. Their designs became simpler, more standardized, more accessible. What began as an elite expression of ritual slowly transformed into a widespread tradition adopted by communities across the peninsula. This was not a decline in craftsmanship or belief. Instead, it hints at a cultural evolution, an expansion of ritual privilege from the few to the many. The stones moved closer to the ground, but closer also to the people. Archaeological layers reveal this transition with gentle clarity. Early dolmens often contain objects of prestige: bronze daggers, elaborate beads, imported ornaments. These items suggest individuals with influence, whose burials symbolize shared memory or clan identity. Later, dolmens contain more modest goods: pottery, stone tools, simple adornments. The shift reflects a broadening worldview. Memory was no longer reserved for the powerful. Ordinary lives began to find their place within the stone tradition, as if the right to be remembered had become universal. This evolution unfolds not as a sudden break, but as a gradual, unfolding dialogue between generations. Each new dolmen carries echoes of those that came before it, yet adapts its form to fit changing beliefs. The high, towering monuments of the north gave way to the box-like chambers of the south. Hybrid forms emerged in central regions as communities blended older customs with new ones. Pottery styles changed. Ritual sequences expanded. The presence of small figurines, beads, and tools suggests a diversification of symbolic meaning, each item a quiet clue to a worldview in motion. Such changes reflect more than aesthetics. They reveal transformations in social structure. As population densities increased and villages grew into networks of interconnected communities, identity became less tied to individual leaders and more tied to groups, lineages, and shared ancestry. Dolmens evolved to reflect these new social bonds. Instead of monumental statements announcing the importance of a single person, many later dolmens appear as humble, intimate spaces, sites where families gathered to honor their dead, where rituals unfolded in ways less dramatic but no less meaningful. Regional identities also began to shape the tradition. In the southwest, dolmens cluster densely across wide plains, forming fields of stones that suggest communal memory woven across generations. In the southeast, stones appear on hillsides overlooking rivers, as though placed to watch over villages below. In central regions, the hybrid forms reflect communities negotiating between older and newer customs. This diversity speaks to a rich cultural mosaic, a peninsula alive with exchange, adaptation, and quiet experimentation. Yet, beneath this evolution lies a deeper mystery. The stones grew smaller, but the tradition grew stronger. The forms became simpler, yet the commitment to building them intensified. This is not a pattern one expects from a fading ritual. It is the opposite. It is the signature of a tradition becoming embedded in everyday life, no longer dependent on elite patronage or centralized authority. It became a cultural thread running through communities great and small. Such a transformation raises the question that lingers beneath every stage of the dolmen's evolution. What was the heart of this tradition? What belief endured through centuries of change, powerful enough to inspire thousands of communities to lift stones, even as their tools, customs, and identities shifted? The early dolmens speak of authority and ceremony. The later ones speak of belonging and memory. Somewhere between them lies a truth that has not yet fully surfaced, a reason the tradition persisted long after its original forms faded. And as this slow arc of change becomes clear, the story now turns toward a deeper inquiry. These monuments served the dead, yes, but did they serve only them? The next step is to explore whether the dolmens were built not just as tombs, but as markers for the living anchors in a landscape shaped as much by ritual as by remembrance. For generations, dolmens have been understood primarily as tombs, solemn places where the dead were laid to rest beneath carefully shaped stones. Yet, as archaeologists surveyed the peninsula more deeply, a quiet complication began to appear. Many dolmens contain no remains at all. No bones, no grave goods, no traces of burial chambers. They stand empty, as though waiting for someone who never arrived. This absence suggests a truth more profound than any single interpretation. These structures may have served not one purpose, but several. They may have belonged as much to the living as to the dead. Their locations hint at this broader role. Some dolmens sit precisely on ridgelines dividing watersheds, marking boundaries that mattered long before mapped borders existed. Others overlook coastal cliffs, poised between land and sea, where ancient communities would have watched tides, tracked migrations, or greeted travelers. In wide river plains, dolmens cluster in places where markets or seasonal gatherings likely unfolded, spaces where people exchanged goods, stories, and ritual obligations. These placements feel intentional, chosen not only for burial, but for visibility, orientation, and communal identity. Imagine a dolmen sitting on a broad hill above a valley. In the daylight, it appears solemn and heavy, a marker of memory. But at dusk, when fires are lit and shadows lengthen, the stone becomes something else. It becomes a gathering point, a place where clans might have assembled to renew alliances, share harvests, or seek guidance from ancestors. The capstone, warmed by fading sunlight, glows faintly as people circle around it. The stone becomes a witness, silent, eternal, anchoring rituals that strengthen bonds among the living. In this light, the dolmen transforms from a tomb into a social instrument. It becomes a landmark, a meeting point, a place where stories were told across generations. Even dolmens that contain burials may have played a dual role. A grave could also mark territory, serve as a beacon for travelers, or function as the spiritual center of a lineage. The dead beneath the stone may have been a symbolic guardian for the living, their presence reinforcing unity within and between communities. The stone's distribution reinforces this interpretation. Dolmens appear along the natural highways of prehistory, riverbanks, narrow valleys, ridgetop passes. These were not random choices. They were the nodes of social life. A dolmen placed along a mountain pass may have signaled safe passage or warned of territorial boundaries. A dolmen rising beside a river bend might have indicated a sacred crossing or a gathering place where communities met seasonally. These structures anchored movement, relationship, and ritual across landscapes that otherwise held no written signs. Even the shape of the stones supports this broader view. The elevated northern-style dolmens, visible from great distances, resemble markers of authority or gathering signals. The southern-style chambered dolmens feel intimate, suited for ritual offerings or private rites. The hybrid forms suggest transitional spaces, places where multiple meanings overlapped. Each style reflects not only burial customs, but the living dynamics of the communities that built them. This perspective opens emotional territory, often overlooked in archaeological reconstruction. If dolmens were also places for the living, then each stone becomes a symbol of belonging. It becomes part of a cultural network that connected families, clans, and distant groups across the peninsula. Perhaps a young traveller, walking through unfamiliar valleys, could locate a dolmen and feel reassured, knowing that others who shared their rituals had once gathered there. The stones thus become guides, not just graves. In the glow of firelight, one can imagine these monuments alive with movement voices rising during ceremonies, children playing at the edges of gatherings, elders leading rituals that blended memory with renewal. The dolmens, immovable and patient, provided the backdrop for these scenes, absorbing whatever the moment required: solemnity, celebration, negotiation, mourning, unity. Reframing the stones this way expands their meaning. They become more than funerary structures. They become touchstones of identity. Each dolmen marks not only where someone was laid to rest, but where communities came together, affirmed their place in the world, and strengthened the ties that allowed them to survive. With this expanded understanding of purpose and evolution, the narrative now turns to the people themselves, the social world that shaped and was shaped by these stones. To picture the world in which Korea's dolmens were built, one must set aside images of kingdoms, armies, and bustling cities. The age of dolmens belonged to quieter societies, small villages nestled along riverbanks, clusters of homes rising on gentle slopes, and settlements shaped by the unbroken cycle of seasons. Here, daily life unfolded with rhythms so steady that centuries later, the landscape still seems to remember them. Imagine waking to the sound of water moving through reeds beside a village stream. Morning light slips through the woven walls of a wooden house, illuminating tools carved from bone and stone, baskets braided from reeds, and clay pots used the night before to simmer grains. Outside, women grind millet on flat stones, while others tend gardens of leafy greens and wild herbs. Men prepare nets for fishing, or sharpen early bronze blades for hunting and agriculture. Children chase each other between drying racks of fish, their laughter echoing through the village like a thread connecting generations. These communities lived closely with the land. They planted millet, barley, and rice in fertile patches near water, adjusting to the rhythm of rains and the turning of the sky. They raised pigs, dogs, and cattle, not in large herds but in modest numbers suited to their needs. They gathered nuts and berries from the forest edges, their movements guided by knowledge passed down through countless seasons. Every task, however small, contributed to the fragile balance of survival, weaving the community together through shared effort. Trade routes, though simple, stretched far beyond the horizon of any single village. Groups travelled along rivers carrying pottery, ornaments made from seashells, bronze tools, and woven textiles. These exchanges were slow, patient, and shaped by trust. A pot made in one region might be found hundreds of kilometers away decades later, carried from hand to hand, linking communities that never met. Through these exchanges, ideas moved as well, rituals, symbols, and stories that gradually shaped a shared cultural identity across the peninsula. Life was not without hardship, yet conflict does not dominate the archaeological record of this era. Instead, what emerges is a portrait of cooperation. The construction of a single dolmen required dozens, sometimes hundreds of hands. Entire families would gather to haul sledges, roll logs, or dig foundations. Elders offered guidance, shamans performed rituals to appease spirits, and skilled workers shaped the stones. These projects unfolded slowly, not as forced labor, but as acts of collective devotion. Each person carried a small part of the burden, transforming physical weight into shared purpose. Domestic life reveals the same unity. Hearths built from river stones served as the heart of each home, glowing with warmth as evenings cooled. Families gathered around these fires to eat simple meals, grains cooked in clay pots, fish roasted over embers, wild vegetables mixed with herbs. The flame illuminated faces that had weathered long days, casting shadows on the walls where tools hung neatly arranged. The quiet conversations drifting through these homes were not recorded, but their essence lingers in the charred remains of hearths archaeologists uncover today. Pottery fragments tell their own story. Designs vary from region to region, yet they all carry a gentle beauty. Curved lines, simple impressions, faint patterns echoing leaves or waves. These pots were functional, but they were also expressions of identity. Each coil of clay, each mark of the potter's hand, contained a small trace of creativity woven into everyday life. The people of the Dolmen age lived without written words, yet nothing about their world was empty or silent. Their beliefs shaped the way they moved across the landscape, the way they honored ancestors, the way they understood their place between earth and sky. When they built dolmens, they were not simply constructing graves. They were reinforcing the social fabric that held them together. The act of raising a stone was a declaration of unity and continuity, a statement that life extended beyond the boundaries of the moment. As we walk through this reconstructed world, the dolmens begin to feel less mysterious. They are the product of ordinary days of meals prepared, fields tended, tools crafted, stories exchanged at dusk, extraordinary monuments born from ordinary hands. And yet, understanding daily life only brings us to the edge of another question. Something must have guided these communities, shaped their decisions, and coordinated their immense collective projects. To discover what governed this ancient world, the story now moves to the forces of leadership, hierarchy, and ritual that lay behind the stones. When we look at the largest Korean dolmen's capstones, weighing more than 100 tons, perched on supports shaped with deliberate precision, it becomes clear that no single family could have raised such monuments alone. These stones required the coordinated labor of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people. They demanded planning, cooperation, and a collective willingness to dedicate time and strength to a task that provided no immediate material reward. To understand how such projects were possible, we must step into the realm of early power. Power that did not resemble kingdoms or states, but something far more fluid. The scale of the grandest dolmens suggests the presence of individuals whose lives carried symbolic weight. Early elites likely emerged not through armies or military conquest, but through ritual significance, lineage, or spiritual authority. A leader whose memory deserved a towering monument may have been one who mediated between the living and the unseen, who guided ceremonies, or who settled disputes through wisdom rather than command. Their authority was woven into the social fabric, subtle yet binding, capable of inspiring the immense communal effort required to move mountains of stone. In these prehistoric societies, power did not concentrate in palaces, there were none. It did not reside in gold, there was little. Instead, influence flowed through relationships, alliances, and obligations maintained over seasons and lifetimes. Chiefs existed, but their role may have been closer to coordinator than ruler. Decisions were shaped by councils of elders, by heads of clans, and by voices respected for their knowledge of land, weather, and ritual. The building of a dolmen was likely not an order imposed from above, but a collective act rooted in shared belief. Archaeologists find clues to this hierarchy in the scale and location of monuments. Larger dolmens appear in regions associated with early centers of social activity, broad river plains, where multiple communities interacted or traded. Smaller dolmens populate more remote areas, reflecting localized authority. This gradient suggests a network of leaders whose influence varied by region, but remained anchored in communal participation. What makes this hierarchy fascinating is its spiritual dimension. In many early societies across Northeast Asia, shamans or ritual specialists held a form of influence equal to, or greater than, political figures. They interpreted dreams, healed illness, conducted ceremonies, and communicated with the ancestors. It is possible that these individuals guided dolmen construction not through force, but through vision. A belief that raising a stone anchored the living to the land and the land to the unseen world. Such a system explains why dolmen distribution seems to follow sacred geography rather than political boundaries. Stones appear along ridgelines, near significant peaks, at river mouths, and in places where natural energy was believed to gather. These locations reflect cosmology, not territory. They reveal a worldview in which spiritual power shaped social decisions, and leaders were judged not by wealth or domination, but by their connection to the unseen. This interpretation reshapes our understanding of early hierarchy. Instead of rigid structures, these societies operated within flexible networks, clans united by shared rituals, loose alliances between villages, seasonal gatherings that reaffirmed social ties. Power moved through these networks like a current, strongest where belief was deepest. A dolmen was both the product of that power and a symbol of it, a monument that elevated one life while reinforcing collective identity. The stones also served as anchors of legitimacy. A leader buried beneath a monumental dolmen achieved a form of immortality, not through written history, but through the presence of a structure that endured for millennia. Every time a traveller passed such a stone, the memory of the buried individual was renewed, and the authority of their lineage subtly reinforced. Yet even as these power structures shaped the land, they never existed apart from belief. Ritual guided hierarchy just as much as hierarchy guided ritual. Authority came not from force, but from understanding of seasons, spirits, and the invisible patterns woven into the world. It is here, in this intersection of leadership and spirituality, that the next stage of the story begins. For to grasp the full meaning of the dolmens, we must look not only at who built them or who led the effort, but at the deeper beliefs that gave those efforts purpose. And so the narrative shifts toward the heart of their worldview, where power yields to faith and ritual takes center stage. To understand why the builders of Korea's dolmens chose stone, we must look beyond tools and social structure and step into the realm that shaped their deepest decisions, the world of spirits. In the age before writing, belief was not a separate sphere of life, it was life itself. Every mountain held a presence, every river carried intention. The wind that moved through pine branches was not merely air, but the voice of something unseen. The people who raised the dolmens lived in a landscape alive with meaning, where geography was not backdrop but participant. Mountains, especially, shaped their worldview. Sharp peaks and rounded ridges acted as anchors of spiritual energy. Many dolmens face these peaks directly, positioned as though in conversation with them. Some align with not just any mountain, but a specific one, perhaps the guardian of a valley, the home of an ancestral spirit, or the symbolic axis of a clan's identity. The dolmen, in this interpretation, becomes a mediator between worlds, the stone reaching upward, the mountain meeting it halfway, the sky completing the exchange. Water, too, played its part. Dolmens appear near springs, river mouths, and lakes where early communities believed spirits gathered or passed between realms. In these places, water served as a mirror of the heavens and a gateway for the dead. A dolmen built beside a river may have been a place where ancestors were called, or where offerings were made before journeys. The orientation of these stones, facing the flow rather than resisting it, suggests an understanding of landscape as a source of both guidance and protection. Shamanistic practices helped shape these connections. Shamans acted as intermediaries, bridging the visible and invisible worlds. They interpreted omens, led rituals, and guided communities through transitions, birth, death, harvest, drought. In their ceremonies, stones held unique significance. They were the most enduring materials available, seen as vessels capable of holding spiritual power or marking the presence of ancestral beings. A dolmen, therefore, was not simply a tomb. It was a threshold where the living could speak to the dead, and where spirits could return to watch over their descendants. Imagine a night thousands of years ago. A village gathers near a dolmen, the air cool, the stars beginning to shimmer above the ridge. A shaman stands beside the stone, holding a bowl of burning herbs. Smoke rises, curling around the capstone, drifting toward the mountain silhouette. People bow their heads, not in fear, but in recognition. To them, the stone is not a monument, it is a doorway, a place where requests, gratitude, and memory pass between realms. In this moment, the dolmen becomes a living part of the sacred landscape. This perspective complicates modern archaeological interpretations. We search for tools, bones, and artifacts, but the builders worked with concepts that leave no physical trace. Their rituals were woven into wind, fire, breath, and belief. Their cosmology shaped where stones were placed and how they were oriented. Yet these decisions survive only as subtle patterns, tilts, angles, distances that seem coincidental until viewed through the lens of spirituality. The more we look, the more the stones appear less like structures and more like inscriptions written in terrain. This spiritual dimension also explains why dolmen building persisted for so long. As communities evolved, as pottery changed, as tools improved, the role of the stone remained central. It was not just tradition, but relationship, an ongoing dialogue with ancestors and spirits who shaped the world. For those who believed the land was alive, to raise a dolmen was to participate in its life, to leave a record of oneself not in writing, but in alignment, effort, and presence. And yet, all traditions, no matter how deep-rooted, eventually encounter forces that reshape them. As time moved forward, the worldview that sustained the dolmens began to shift. New technologies arrived, new political structures formed, and new spiritual ideas took root. The stones remained, but the world around them changed. With the builder's spiritual universe illuminated, the story now moves toward a turning point, the era when these ancient rituals begin to wane, and the once living tradition of stone slowly fades into silence. For centuries, the dolmens rose one after another, great stones lifted into place by hands, guided by ritual, memory, and a sense of belonging that tied each generation to the last. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rhythm changed. The age that had birthed thousands of megaliths began to soften, its traditions drifting like fading breath on the landscape. There was no single event, no dramatic collapse, no invading force that shattered the old world overnight. Instead, a quiet transformation unfolded, one that rewrote the way communities lived, worked, and understood themselves. The shift began with technology. Iron, at first rare and precious, began to replace bronze. The new metal cut deeper, lasted longer, and reshaped the tools people used to cultivate fields, hunt animals, and defend settlements. With iron came efficiency, and with efficiency came change. Fields expanded, food production increased, populations grew, villages strengthened their boundaries, building fortified walls of earth and wood. Where once small, interconnected communities had shared labor for rituals, now larger, more structured societies began to form, knitting together in ways that required new priorities. As agriculture intensified, the world of the dolmens based on seasonal gathering, shared rituals, and fluid social networks grew more distant. People spent more time tending crops, storing surplus, and managing herds. The rhythms that had once aligned entire regions began to diverge. The collective energy that had raised monumental stones now flowed into different tasks, clearing forests, irrigating fields, preparing for trade or conflict. Life became more organized, more hierarchical, less dependent on communal rituals that stretched across miles of open land. Political structures evolved as well. Leaders who had once derived power from spiritual authority began to wield influence through control of resources, territory, and alliances. The rise of early state-like formations meant decisions were increasingly made within fortified settlements rather than across shared landscapes. The dolmens' open-air monuments that relied on broad cooperation no longer fit neatly into this emerging world of walls and defined borders. As authority shifted, so did the rituals that reinforced it. Spiritual practices changed too. The shamanistic worldview that had animated the megalithic tradition did not vanish, but it adapted. New forms of burial appeared. Mounded tombs, elaborate wooden coffins, burial goods reflecting growing wealth and status. These new customs conveyed different ideas about death and the afterlife, emphasizing personal identity and lineage in ways the communal dolmens never had. The stones, with their silent simplicity, came to feel like relics of a gentler time, respected but no longer central. And yet, the decline was not abrupt. For generations, dolmens continued to be built, though smaller in scale and fewer in number. Some communities held on to the tradition longer than others, raising final stones in valleys where older beliefs lingered. The last dolmens, simple and low to the ground, feel almost like whispers, ritual gestures carried out by people who sensed the world changing, but were not ready to let go. Then, eventually, the tradition faded. The labor required no longer fit the pace of life. The worldview that sustained it no longer shaped decisions. The dolmens remained, but the age that created them slipped quietly into memory. There is a melancholy beauty in this slow ending. Cultures rarely vanish with sudden finality. They shift, transform, adapt, and leave behind traces of what once mattered most. The dolmens became such traces anchors of an earlier identity, scattered across hills and plains as reminders of a time when communities shaped the land with ceremony instead of strategy. They remained as echoes of belief systems that no longer guided daily life, yet continued to resonate beneath it. Walking among these stones today, one can feel the softness of that transition. The dolmens do not protest their abandonment, they simply endure. They watch as villages become towns, as towns become cities, as roads and fields replace the pathways once used by ritual gatherings. They remain patient, standing in quiet testimony to a world that flowed into another, without violence or destruction, only change. And it is precisely in this gentleness that the mystery deepens. What forces, what ideas, what new structures rose strong enough to replace a tradition so deeply woven into the land? To answer this, the story now steps deeper into the shifting currents of the peninsula, where new powers emerged and reshaped the world the dolmens once defined. As the Bronze Age waned, the quiet rhythms that had shaped the peninsula for centuries began to shift beneath the weight of something new. The Iron Age arrived not as a single moment, but as a gradual transformation. Iron blades glinting where bronze once shone, fortified settlements rising where open villages once stood, and the faint outlines of future kingdoms forming in places where clans had long shared the land. These changes did not erase the megalith builders, but they altered the world around them so completely that the traditions sustaining the dolmens could no longer hold their place. Communities that had once centered their identities around ritual gatherings and ancestral stones now found themselves drawn into the orbit of emerging political powers. The foundations of what would become the three kingdoms, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, began forming through alliances, conflicts, and the consolidation of territory. Leaders wielded force as readily as belief. Armies replaced seasonal work groups. Authority shifted from shamans interpreting the unseen world to warriors defending borders and expanding influence. Power became tied to land, wealth, and lineage in ways the dolmen builders had never known. With these new structures came new customs. Burial practices transformed dramatically. Instead of broad capstones resting on upright stones, communities began constructing tumuli earth mounds that rose above enclosed chambers. These mounds reflected a different worldview, one concerned with status, inheritance, and the display of power. Where the dolmens had emphasized connection to landscape and cosmos, the tumuli emphasized hierarchy. They were symbols of authority, intended to be seen as markers of political strength rather than communal devotion. Writing systems also began to appear, carried into the peninsula through cultural exchanges with China. Symbols carved onto bamboo slips or etched into metal allowed leaders to record laws, lineages, and diplomatic messages. With writing came memory of a different sort, one preserved through ink rather than stone. The need for monumental markers of identity diminished as new forms of documentation grew. And yet, through all of this, the dolmens remained. No king attempted to destroy them. No army dismantled them. They stood untouched on hillsides overlooking fortified cities, beside new fields carved by iron ploughs, and along roadways travelled by merchants and messengers. Their silence became their power. They anchored landscapes that were rapidly changing, their age and endurance lending them an aura that even emerging states hesitated to challenge. As centuries passed, the meaning of the dolmens changed. People no longer remembered the builders or the rituals that once animated the stones. But forgetting did not diminish the monuments, it transformed them. In some regions, villagers believed the dolmens were houses of dragons, their capstones marking places where the mythical creatures rested between journeys. In others, they were said to be the tombs of ancient warriors whose strength was so great that even kings feared disturbing them. Some believed the stones were left by supernatural beings, giants, or sky-descended ancestors whose touch had blessed the land. These interpretations were not archaeological theories. They were living stories, shaped by imagination, reverence, and fear. They reveal how deeply the stones had embedded themselves into the cultural psyche. Even as new powers rose and fell, the dolmens persisted as reminders of something older than kingdoms, older than armies, older than written memory. They became part of the spiritual landscape of later Korea, woven into folktales, rituals, and local customs that lasted long after the political world changed around them. To the emerging states of the peninsula, the dolmens may have seemed relics, signposts of a forgotten era, but to the people who lived near them, They remained places where the boundary between past and present felt thin. Offerings were sometimes left beside them. Children played around them and whispered stories. Travelers paused before them, sensing the weight of time pressing gently through the moss and lichen that covered their surfaces. The arrival of new powers did not erase the stones. It only layered new meanings upon them, turning history into legend and ritual into myth. And as these stories deepened, the Dolmens slipped from the realm of practical memory into the realm of imagination. From here, the documentary steps into that realm, where stones no longer belong solely to archaeology, but to the myths that kept them alive long after their builders vanished. As centuries rolled across the peninsula, the people who built the Dolmens faded into silence. Their names, their rituals, their intentions, all slipped beyond the reach of memory. But the stones remained patient, immovable, enduring every shift of culture and power. And when memory disappeared, imagination stepped forward. In village after village, new stories took root to explain the silent monuments that dotted hillsides and river valleys. The Dolmens, once practical structures shaped by human hands, became portals to worlds where ordinary explanations no longer sufficed. One story spoke of giants who walked across mountain ranges as easily as others walked across fields. These beings, enormous and strong, were said to have lifted the stones with effortless grace, carrying capstones on their shoulders as though they were no heavier than baskets of grain. In these tales, the Dolmens became proof not of human labor, but of ancient beings who shaped the land long before smaller people arrived. The exaggerated scale of the capstones fed these myths. The stone's weight transformed into evidence of supernatural strength. Another set of legends focused on dragons, creatures revered in Korean folklore, not as destroyers, but as guardians of water, mountains, and hidden knowledge. Some believed the Dolmens marked places where dragons had descended, their power pressing into the earth and hardening into stone. Others said the capstones sealed entrances to underground pathways, where dragon spirits travelled during storms. In these stories, the Dolmens shimmered with an aura of danger and reverence. Disturbing them risked angering forces that shaped the land itself. There were stories, too, of ancient kings whose deeds were so legendary that the earth rose to honour them. These rulers, half human and half divine, were said to have commanded stones into place with their voices alone, ordering the earth to remember them. In such tales, dolmens became monuments not to forgotten villagers, but to mythical figures who lived in the hazy realm between history and dream. The enduring stones became stand-ins for lost thrones, lost kingdoms, and the lost age of heroes that every culture imagines behind its dawn. As with all legends, these tales grew because the truth had grown distant. People saw the stones and felt compelled to fill the silence with meaning. Folklore became a bridge, connecting the present to a past no one could recall. Even the smallest child, hearing stories from elders, they would come to understand that the dolmens were extraordinary, so extraordinary that only giants, dragons, or ancient monarchs could explain their presence. Yet within these stories lies a subtle echo of reality. Giants may not have walked the mountains, but the builders of the dolmens did move stones of astonishing size. Dragons may not have shaped the land, but the builders oriented their monuments towards sacred peaks and water sources. Legendary kings may not have commanded stones with magic, but leaders with spiritual authority did guide communities to raise these massive structures. Folklore exaggerates, embellishes, transforms, but it also preserves. Beneath every myth lies a fragment of something true. This is the quiet power of the dolmens. They endured long enough to become more than archaeology. They rooted themselves in the imagination of generations who no longer understood their origins, yet instinctively sensed their importance. Myths grew where memory faded, suggesting that even when the facts vanished, the emotional resonance of the stones remained. The dolmens continued to shape identity, story, and place, long after their original meaning disappeared. And so we arrive at a threshold in the documentary. We have followed the stones from their creation through their transformation into legend. Now, a new chapter begins, one in which the ancient monuments re-enter the world of knowledge. After centuries of myth-making, scholars, explorers, and villagers alike rediscovered the dolmens and began asking questions once buried beneath layers of folklore. From here, the narrative shifts from myth to rediscovery, revealing how modern eyes found new wonder in these old stones. For thousands of years, the dolmens of Korea stood in open fields, on mountain ridges, beside rivers that carved their way through the peninsula. They watched kingdoms rise and fall, watched villages expand and disappear, watched centuries pass like drifting clouds. And yet, for most of human history, no one outside these lands truly saw them. The world, distracted by other monuments, Egypt's pyramids, Britain's stone circles, the megaliths of Brittany, looked elsewhere. Korea's stones waited in silence, patient as always. When Western scholars first encountered the idea of megaliths in the 19th century, they assumed Europe held the key to understanding such structures. The field grew around Stonehenge and Karnak, not around the hills of Gochang or Hwasun. Early Korean scholars, focused on dynastic histories and classical texts, often overlooked the stones as remnants of a time deemed too ancient, too obscure to study deeply. Thus, the dolmens remained largely unnoticed, immense, undeniable, yet somehow invisible. It was not until the 20th century that archaeologists finally turned their eyes toward the peninsula. What they found there forced them to rewrite assumptions that had shaped the discipline for decades. Teams of researchers walked through rice fields and forest edges, expecting scattered stones. Instead, they discovered hundreds, then thousands of dolmens spread across the landscape with astonishing density. Entire valleys revealed themselves as megalithic preserves, each stone positioned with intention, each capstone testifying to labor beyond anything expected from early agrarian communities. The moment of realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded through slow, methodical work. Archaeologists knelt beside tilted slabs, brushing away soil to reveal burial goods, bronze daggers, pottery shards, stone beads. They measured capstone thickness, mapped alignments, catalogued differences in form. They dug trenches around dolmen supports to understand construction techniques. Each excavation peeled back a layer of time, revealing clues that hinted at a civilization both sophisticated and elusive. Researchers walked ridgelines, GPS devices in hand, tracing the silent logic of the dolmen's placement. They noted patterns familiar from European sites: orientation, clustering, alignment, but on a scale far greater than anything seen in the West. The peninsula seemed less like a land scattered with monuments, and more like a single vast memorial, built by generations who had understood the land in ways that modern scholars were only beginning to grasp. What startled archaeologists most was not only the number of dolmens, but their diversity. Massive northern table-type structures loomed beside slender southern box-type chambers. Hybrid forms appeared in transitional regions. Capstones varied from rough, jagged slabs to carefully shaped blocks with smooth undersides. Such variation revealed a long evolutionary arc, suggesting that the megalithic tradition had endured in Korea for centuries longer than originally believed. This was not an imported idea. It was a cultural inheritance shaped and reshaped across deep time. As findings accumulated, a sense of belated recognition spread through the scholarly world. The assumption that Europe was the natural center of megalithic culture no longer held. Korea possessed the largest concentration of dolmens on Earth, a revelation that required archaeologists to reconsider how ancient societies developed monumental architecture. The peninsula, once considered peripheral in discussions of early human history, emerged suddenly as a focal point. Its stones demanded attention not as local curiosities, but as global evidence of humanity's shared impulse to anchor belief into earth and sky. Yet the discoveries stirred something deeper than academic surprise. Standing among thousands of stones, archaeologists felt a quiet awe, the sense that they had arrived late to a story already long in motion. The dolmens had endured wars, dynasties, invasions, and centuries of change, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Their silence was not emptiness, but patience, and when the world finally listened, the stones revealed a chapter of human history that had been hiding in plain sight. This moment of rediscovery reshaped the narrative of megalithic studies. Korea was no longer a footnote. It became a centerpiece, a landscape that forced scholars to rethink how ancient people organized labor, understood ritual, and imagined their place in the cosmos. But recognition raised another question, one that scholars could not ignore. How do Korea's dolmens compare with those found in distant corners of the world? And what does that comparison reveal about the human need to build with stone? From here, the story expands outward, reaching toward the global megalithic tradition to place Korea's stones within a wider, deeper context. When archaeologists finally placed Korea's dolmens on the global map, they were confronted with a startling truth. This small peninsula contained a megalithic world as vast and varied as any found across continents. To understand its significance, the stones must be seen not in isolation, but in conversation with the great megalithic traditions of the wider world. Europe's stone circles, India's burial chambers, the Middle East's slab-lined tombs. Only then does the full mystery come into view. In Europe, megaliths rise in deliberate formations, circles aligned to the solstices, passage graves angled toward sunrise, standing stones marking processional pathways. These monuments often functioned as ceremonial centres, places where the community gathered to witness the changing sky. Stonehenge, Karnak, Avebury, names that resonate across the archaeological imagination. Yet Europe's megaliths, spread across vast territories, number only a fraction of those in Korea. In India's Deccan Plateau, dolmens appear across rocky landscapes, built from thick slabs arranged into chambers. Their construction, like Korea's, required immense cooperation, and they often include capstones carefully balanced on upright supports. But here, too, the distribution is scattered, rarely forming the dense fields that define Korea's megalithic heartlands. The Middle East offers its own traditions: stone circles in Jordan, cairns in Israel, chambered tombs in Arabia. These structures reveal a shared human impulse to honor the dead, to mark sacred spaces, to connect earth and sky through stone. And yet, once again, they never reach the overwhelming concentration found on the Korean peninsula. Across all these regions, one pattern emerges. Megaliths reflect universal human concerns: memory, ritual, identity, the need to create permanence in a world shaped by impermanence. Monument building did not belong to one culture or continent. It flowed through early humanity like a shared intuition. People everywhere looked at stone, the most enduring material they knew, and saw a canvas for their beliefs. This realization binds distant cultures together, revealing a prehistoric network of ideas that transcended language and geography. And still, Korea stands apart. Nowhere else did megalith building persist so long or reach such staggering density. Thousands of stones rise across the peninsula, not as isolated expressions, but as a continuous tradition spanning centuries. The evolution from towering northern-type dolmens to intimate southern chambers has no parallel in Europe or India. While other regions shifted quickly from megaliths to new architectural forms, Korea sustained its stone-building impulse far longer, as though the culture found something in the practice that resonated deeply across generations. Even the layout of Korean dolmens differs in subtle but telling ways. European sites often center around a single monumental complex. Korea, by contrast, presents landscapes filled with stones, fields where dolmens stretch to the horizon, ridges lined with capstones, valleys marked by clusters that appear almost like ancient neighborhoods. This was not monument building in service of a central authority. It was something more distributed, more communal, more woven into daily life. When viewed globally, Korea's dolmens become one of prehistory's brightest yet most overlooked stars. The peninsula shines not because its stones are larger than those of Europe or older than those of the Middle East, but because they reveal a cultural commitment unlike any other. The builders did not create a single masterpiece. They created an entire world of stone. Seeing these global traditions side by side invites a humbling thought. Monumental stone building was never a race, nor a sign of superiority. It was a shared human expression, parallel responses to questions every society faced. What happens after death? How do we mark significance? How do we honor ancestors? How do we create meaning that outlasts us? Korea's answer was to fill its land with stones, to let the landscape itself become a memorial. And as the documentary moves forward, the global comparison sets the stage for something more scientific. The stones have shown us their forms, their patterns, their evolution. Now comes the question that modern research struggles to answer. What final secrets remain within the earth, the bones, and the stones themselves? From here, the story steps into the realm of scientific investigation, where archaeology, geology, and new technologies attempt to illuminate the last mysteries of the Korean megaliths. Modern science approaches the dolmens with tools their builders could never have imagined. Machines that pierce the earth, instruments that measure invisible traces, methods that sort centuries into neat sequences of dates. And yet, for all this sophistication, the stones remain strangely resistant. They offer clues, yes, but they rarely surrender them fully. Instead, as researchers dig, scan, and analyze, the Dolmens seem to draw them deeper into questions that grow more complicated the closer they are studied. Radiocarbon dating has provided the first threads of chronology. Charcoal fragments from ancient hearths, bone particles from burial chambers, and soil layers beneath capstones allow scientists to estimate the age of each structure. These dates stretch across an astonishing timeline, from early Bronze Age beginnings to later, more standardized forms that persisted for centuries. But the spread is uneven. Clusters of dolmens appear suddenly in some regions, as if an entire community decided to reshape its landscape all at once. Why here? Why then? The data offers patterns without explanations. Pollen analysis reveals environmental clues. In soil preserved beneath dolmens, scientists find tiny grains that map the ancient vegetation of surrounding areas. These microscopic remnants suggest that some dolmens were built in forests that no longer exist, others in grasslands, long overtaken by agriculture. Such findings hint at vanished ecosystems and forgotten climate shifts, but they also complicate interpretations. Were dolmens placed in open sacred spaces? Or did they become sacred because forest grew or receded around them? The pollen whispers possibilities but leaves intent unspoken. Ground-penetrating radar lifts a veil from the earth without disturbing it. Through these scans, researchers discover hidden chambers, pathways, and foundation stones that were once covered by centuries of weather and soil. In some cases, radar reveals that a dolmen was not built once, but modified. Over time, its chamber expanded, its supports adjusted, its capstone repositioned. These modifications hint at rituals lasting generations. Yet the reasons for such changes, practical, ceremonial, symbolic, remain unpredictable. The stones speak in actions, not explanations. Landscape archaeology attempts to read the broader picture. By mapping dolmens across entire regions considering elevation, proximity to water, solar orientation, and neighboring settlements, scholars reconstruct the ancient mind's relationship with the land. Patterns emerge. Lines that follow old ridges, clusters near ritual routes, groupings that mirror social networks. But even these patterns evade simple interpretation. For every principle discovered, exceptions appear. A dolmen facing a mountain in one valley faces sunrise in another. A cluster aligned with water in one region aligns with wind in another. The stones obey rules that seem to shift across centuries. Perhaps the most humbling discoveries come from excavation. Burial goods once believed to follow strict patterns reveal unexpected variety. Some chambers contain finely crafted bronze daggers, while others hold only a few pottery shards or nothing at all. Human remains, when present, are often fragmentary, scattered, or absent entirely. Such inconsistencies disrupt earlier assumptions that dolmens served a single, uniform purpose. They force researchers to consider that meaning changed over time, that different communities use similar forms for entirely different reasons. In this way, science does not close the mystery, it widens it. Each new method illuminates part of the puzzle while casting deeper shadows elsewhere. The dolmens refuse to behave like simple tombs or standardized monuments. They are too varied, too widespread, too layered with symbolic intent to reduce to one explanation. Their complexity reveals something profound. Ancient cultures were not primitive precursors to modern society, but sophisticated worlds with their own logic, their own cosmology, their own forms of knowledge. As the stones withstand scrutiny, they remind researchers and viewers that the past is not a puzzle to be solved once and for all. It is a landscape of possibilities, some revealed by science, others left to intuition and imagination. In these silent structures, evidence and mystery live side by side. With the scientific foundation laid, the narrative now shifts from data to emotion, from what we can measure to what we can feel, opening the door to a deeper exploration of why these stones still move us after thousands of years. When we walk among the dolmens today, we see only the stones silent, heavy, weathered by time. But each one once marked a life, a breath, a presence, a set of hands that shaped the earth and then slipped quietly into it. The megalithic landscape of Korea is not just an archaeological puzzle. It is a cemetery without names, a memory field where thousands of stories lie sleeping beneath layers of soil and silence. Imagine the first of these stories. A small community gathers on a cool morning. Mist clings to the riverbank. A family stands near a freshly dug chamber, their faces still streaked with the smoke of the funeral pyre. They carry polished stones, strings of beads, a clay bowl filled with grains, gifts for someone they loved. A shaman murmurs prayers that drift toward the treetops. Then the capstone, massive and trembling on wooden rollers, is guided into place. As it settles, a hush falls over the group. This stone, they believe, will hold the spirits steady, anchoring them to the living for a little while longer. Or picture another story, a leader whose voice once carried across an entire valley. Not a king in the later sense, but someone whose wisdom shaped decisions, whose presence brought comfort. When that leader died, the community gathered in numbers far beyond the village. People walked for days to reach the burial site, bringing offerings, food, and songs. The dolmen raised in this leader's honor stood tall, visible from distant paths. Its capstone was so enormous that later generations would attribute its construction to giants, but it was ordinary hands, countless hands, that lifted it into place. Then there were the quiet stories. The farmer who tended millet fields, the fisher whose nets often tangled with river reeds, the child who once carried water from a spring and never returned. Some dolmens may belong to these unrecorded lives, not elites, not ritual leaders, but people whose communities believed memory should not vanish. In these moments, the stones become more than monuments. They become acts of resistance against forgetting. Archaeology often describes dolmens in terms of structure and function, but beneath each capstone lies an individual who lived a full human life, someone who laughed, cried, feared storms, celebrated harvests, and watched children grow. The dolmens are reminders that early societies were filled not with abstractions, but with people whose emotions mirrored our own. Their worries, their hopes, their griefs. All of it is embedded in the soil surrounding these stones. When we imagine the past in this way, the dolmens shift in meaning. They are no longer merely megaliths. They are love stories. They are farewell letters written in stone. They are the last fingerprints of lives swallowed by time. The builders may not have left texts, but they left gestures, memorials to say, this person mattered. This life was worth anchoring to the earth. And though centuries have passed, the emotional weight remains. Standing before a dolmen, we sense a presence, not of spirits or myths, but of humanity itself. The stones remind us that across thousands of years, people have tried to hold on to memory, to resist the erasing power of time. The dolmens are proof of this ancient struggle against oblivion. Yet the tragedy is equally profound. For all the effort poured into these monuments, almost every name is gone. Almost every story is lost. The dolmens preserved the fact of a life, but not its details, the voice, the habits, the dreams, the singular way someone might have smiled at dusk. These intimate traces dissolved into the wind, leaving only stone shadows behind. But perhaps this is why the dolmens touch us so deeply. They reveal that forgetting is inevitable, yet remembering is a choice. The stones, heavy and enduring, invite us to imagine the lives beneath them. They ask us to fill the silence with empathy, to walk slowly, to listen, to acknowledge that human existence, even when erased by time, still leaves a residue of meaning. And as the documentary now widens its view again from individuals to entire cultures, the stones remind us that these countless personal stories formed the foundations of a world that has long vanished. The past, in all its complexity, rises from these silent markers and continues its whisper. From here, the narrative expands outward, exploring how entire societies, not just single lives, were shaped by the megalithic tradition. Long after the last dolmen was raised, the worldview that shaped the Age of Stones continued to ripple through the peninsula. The megalith builders themselves vanished, absorbed into later societies. Their languages lost, their rituals transformed, but their ways of seeing the world did not disappear. Instead, they softened, shifted, and quietly rooted themselves in the soil of Korean culture. The stones remained as landmarks, but the beliefs that once animated them survived as echoes faint yet persistent, like a melody whose tune is forgotten, but whose rhythm remains. One of the clearest echoes lies in ancestor rituals. Modern Korean ceremonies, honoring the dead Chuseok offerings, memorial tables, graves tended on hillsides, carry the same underlying conviction that the living and the dead remain connected. The dolmens embodied this relationship in stone, anchoring ancestral presence to the landscape. Over time, the specific form changed, but the emotional truth endured. Memory requires a place, and honoring the past strengthens the living. The shift from megaliths to earth mounds to modern grave sites reflects transformation, not rupture. Geomancy, or pungsu-jiri, offers another thread connecting ancient to modern. The practice of orienting homes, graves, and temples according to landforms, mountains, rivers, ridges echoes the megalithic instinct to align stones with sacred geography. The dolmen builders placed monuments where energy felt strong, where mountains faced water, where valleys converged in gentle balance. Today, pungsu practitioners read the land with similar intuition, seeking harmony between people and the shape of the earth. Though the tools differ, the impulse is the same. The land is alive, and its contours matter. Even Korea's cultural reverence for mountains reflects this ancient worldview. Peaks like Jirisan, Seoraksan, and Hallasan are still seen as spiritual spaces, their presence shaping rituals, pilgrimages, and folklore. The dolmen builders shared this understanding, orienting many stones towards specific heights, treating mountains as guardians rather than obstacles. In this light, the mountains become vessels of memory, carrying forward beliefs older than writing, older than kingdoms, older than recorded history. The aesthetic of Korean traditional homes, their positioning against slopes, their openness toward the south also carries faint traces of megalithic thinking. These architectural choices echo the ancient instinct to harmonize with sunlight, wind flow, and land contours. While the connection is not direct, it is philosophical. Human life should situate itself within nature, not against it. This idea permeates Korean cultural expression, from temple placement to garden design to poetry. Even the folklore surrounding stones, dragon stones, guardian stones, wish-granting stones, may be distant reflections of the megalithic age. When later villagers told stories of giants and spirits shaping dolmens, they were preserving, in symbolic form, the ancient belief that stone is more than material. It is memory, boundary, and presence. These tales kept the emotional truth alive long after the original rituals were forgotten. Cultures often leave behind visible ruins. But the megalithic builders left something more subtle, a worldview woven into how people relate to land, death, ancestors, and the unseen. The dolmens were not merely monuments. They were expressions of an understanding that life flows through generations, through rivers, through mountains, through the turning of the sky. And though the physical structures fell out of use, the worldview endured, slipping from stone into story, from story into ritual, from ritual into daily life. This continuity challenges the notion that history is linear. Instead, it rises and falls like breath, ideas fading, resurfacing, reshaping themselves across time. The megalithic worldview did not vanish. It changed form, finding new expressions across centuries. Korea today stands atop layers of memory far older than its written history, each layer a quiet echo of the people who first shaped the land with stone. With this widening perspective moving from individuals to cultures, from stones to belief, the narrative now reaches towards something broader still, the universal human experience. What do these ancient builders reveal, not only about Korea, but about all of us? The story expands to explore what it means to build, remember, and leave traces across the vast arc of time. Across the world, long before writing, before kingdoms, before the rise of cities, humans lifted stones. They shaped them, aligned them, carried them across valleys, and raised them toward the sky. Korea's dolmens are only one example of this impulse, one chapter in a much larger human story that stretches from the pyramids of Egypt to the menhirs of Brittany, from the cairns of Scotland to the stone chambers of India. The forms differ, the rituals vary, yet the underlying instinct feels strangely familiar, a desire to carve meaning into the physical world before time can wash it away. Why do human beings do this? What compels us to move mountains of stone when our own lives are so short, so fragile? Part of the answer lies in memory. Early people feared forgetting as deeply as we do today. Without writing, memory was vulnerable, dependent on the voices of elders, fading with each generation. A stone monument was a safeguard, a vessel that could hold the weight of remembrance long after voices fell silent. A dolmen, a cairn, a pyramid. Each one whispered the same message across cultures. Someone lived, someone mattered, do not let this vanish. Another part lies in legacy. Humans have always sought to leave traces of themselves, even when they expected nothing in return. A stone raised on a ridge might outlive 1,000 generations. It becomes a marker of presence, a claim not of territory, but of existence. The builders of the Korean dolmens, like those of Stonehenge or Göbekli Tepe, understood that while time erases stories, it hesitates when faced with stone. Through the act of building, they reached beyond their own years, touching a future they could not imagine. Yet the impulse goes deeper still. Monuments are not merely expressions of memory, they are bridges between worlds. Whether the builders believed in ancestors, spirits, gods, or cosmic rhythms, they used stone as a way of grounding the intangible. A capstone, placed at a precise angle, might echo the angle of a sunrise. A chamber aligned to a mountain peak might reflect a sacred relationship between earth and sky. Across cultures, stones became tools to converse with what lay beyond human understanding. This yearning for connection resonates even now. We build monuments of our own towers, memorials, shrines, statues, each one a declaration that meaning can be anchored in the material world. We may use different materials, but the instinct is the same. We want the things we value to last. We want our grief, our pride, our awe, our stories to extend past our own lifetimes. Korea's dolmens embody this universal impulse in a uniquely powerful way. Their sheer number hints at a society where monument building was not limited to elites, but embraced by ordinary people. Each stone stands as a fragment of hope, fear, love, duty, or devotion. Each stone represents humans grappling with the same questions that have followed us across millennia. What does it mean to be alive? How do we honor the dead? How do we find our place in a world so vast and shifting? The dolmens remind us that ancient people were not so distant from us. They felt the same vulnerability, the same awareness that life is brief, that memory fades, that meaning must be shaped with intention. Their monuments were not built out of arrogance, but out of humility. They understood how small a human life is, and so they turned to stone, the most enduring material they knew, to speak on their behalf. When we zoom out across continents and centuries, the Korean dolmens become part of a grand mosaic of human expression. Cultures, separated by oceans, arrived at similar answers to existential questions. They touched the earth, lifted stones, and carved their hopes into structures meant to withstand wind, rain, and time itself. And from this philosophical vantage point, the story now turns toward the modern era, where these ancient impulses meet the challenges of preservation, rediscovery, and the fragile task of protecting memory against the erosion of the present. For thousands of years, the dolmens of Korea endured. They survived storms that ripped through valleys, wars that reshaped kingdoms, and seasons that rose and fell in endless cycles. They survived the disappearance of the people who built them and the forgetting of their stories. Time tried to take them, yet the stones remained. And now, in an age of machines and concrete, their greatest threat no longer comes from nature or neglect. It comes from us. As Korea modernized, landscapes transformed at a pace no ancient builder could have imagined. Cities expanded, roads carved across fields, factories rose beside streams where stonecutters once worked. Some dolmens found themselves standing in the middle of farmland, their capstones surrounded by neatly planted rows of rice or barley. Others ended up squeezed between apartment complexes, their presence a quiet challenge to the logic of urban growth. Many more disappeared entirely, lifted away for construction projects, buried by development, or simply eroded by constant human movement. The stones, once anchors of a sacred worldview, now faced threats of a different kind. Not intentional destruction, but indifference. The preservation community saw this danger long before most people realized what could be lost. Archaeologists, historians, and local advocates traveled across the peninsula, documenting dolmens before they vanished. They mapped fields, measured chambers, photographed sites, and wrote urgent reports. They understood that once a dolmen was destroyed, not just a stone, but a memory was erased, a fragment of human experience gone forever. Their work sparked national recognition of the need to protect these ancient monuments. In time, preservation efforts gathered strength. Korea designated several dolmen clusters as protected cultural heritage. The sites of Gochang, Hwasun, and Ganghwa, each containing hundreds of stones, were recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Visitors to these regions now walk carefully marked paths, reading plaques that explain the age, structure, and significance of each dolmen. Protective barriers prevent damage, while observation decks encourage appreciation without intrusion. What was once overlooked has become a source of pride. Yet, preservation is never as simple as fencing off a site. The dolmens sit in living landscapes, fields still cultivated, forests still changing, rivers still carving new paths. Protecting the stones means balancing the needs of communities with the demands of heritage. Farmers who have worked the land for generations must adapt their practices. Developers must reroute construction plans. Local governments must weigh economic growth against the responsibility to maintain cultural memory. The tension is real. A road built too close can destabilize a dolmen's foundation. Heavy machinery can trigger vibrations that loosen ancient supports. Pollution can accelerate the weathering of stone. Even tourism, if unmanaged, can damage fragile environments. Preservation is an ongoing struggle, one that requires vigilance, funding, public support, and patience. The dolmens, resilient as they are, cannot defend themselves. They depend on us. There is, however, a deeper layer to this responsibility. Preserving dolmens is not just about archaeology. It is about honoring the people whose voices never reached us through writing. It is about protecting their final gestures carved into stone long before our time. When a dolmen collapses or is removed, the loss is not merely structural. It is emotional. It is the disappearance of a message left by someone who once stood where we stand, breathing the same air, looking at the same mountains. Modern Koreans increasingly recognize this connection. Local communities often take pride in nearby dolmens, incorporating them into festivals, cultural programs, and school curricula. Some villages maintain dolmens as sacred sites, cleaning the area, leaving offerings, or hosting seasonal rituals. In these moments, the stones re-enter the living world, not as tourist attractions, but as participants in cultural memory. They become reminders that history is not a relic, but a relationship. Yet the question remains, can they survive us? Can they withstand not only time's erosion but the pressures of a rapidly changing world? The answer depends on choices made now, choices about land, heritage, and identity. As we turn to the next chapter, the narrative shifts from preservation to revival. How these ancient stones, once nearly forgotten, are finding new meaning in modern Korea. For much of the modern era, the dolmens stood unnoticed, silent stones, overshadowed by the urgencies of nation-building, industrial growth, and urban expansion. People passed them on their way to school or work without a second glance. They were simply part of the landscape, familiar but unexamined. And then, almost as quietly as the tradition had faded, the stones began to come alive again, not physically, but culturally. A new generation turned its gaze toward them, and fascination returned like a long-delayed echo. Part of this revival began through education and research. Archaeological discoveries made headlines, drawing attention to the staggering number of dolmens and their global significance. School children visited dolmen fields on field trips, learning that these silent structures were not random stones, but monuments older than many civilizations they studied in textbooks. As awareness grew, the stones took on new meaning not just as relics, but as pieces of Korea's identity that had been hiding in plain sight. Tourism followed. At Gochang, Ganghwa, and Hwasun, paths were built, signs erected, observation decks installed. Visitors walked among the stones at sunrise, watching light spill across capstones, exactly as it had thousands of years ago. Young couples took photographs beneath the arch of a dolmen, feeling the weight of history pressing gently around them. Artists sketched silhouettes of capstones against twilight. The stones became not only historical objects but aesthetic experiences, places where time slowed, where the modern world felt briefly distant. Social media amplified this transformation. Photos of dolmen fields went viral, captured in drone shots and long-exposure night images, where stars arched over ancient capstones. Younger Koreans, finding themselves increasingly curious about origins and heritage, shared these images with awe. The stones, once ignored, became symbols of endurance, reminders that identity reaches deeper than recent centuries. Influencers narrated quiet walks through dolmen clusters. Documentary channels posted theories. Students created blogs exploring megalithic mysteries. What had once been a niche interest turned into a cultural spark. Festivals emerged as well. In some regions, communities now host annual celebrations honoring their dolmen heritage. Lanterns illuminate fields at night. Musicians perform beside ancient stones, and storytellers share folk tales about giants and dragon spirits. These events do not attempt to reconstruct the original rituals. They create new relationships with the stones, acknowledging the past while shaping fresh meanings for the present. Through these gatherings, dolmens re-enter public life as spaces of reflection, imagination, and connection. Even contemporary spirituality finds resonance in the stones. Some visitors describe feeling a strange calm near Dolmens, as though the weight of the capstone steadies the mind. Others come seeking grounding, treating the stones as places for meditation or quiet contemplation. Whether or not these feelings connect to ancient belief systems, they reveal a universal truth. Humans still seek meaning in old places. The Dolmens, enduring and unchanging, offer a rare sense of continuity in a world that moves too quickly. Academic interest deepens alongside public fascination. New studies explore construction techniques, ritual functions, alignments, and cultural evolution. Korean scholars collaborate with researchers from Europe, India, and Southeast Asia to understand megalithic traditions across continents. These efforts position Korea not as a peripheral member of global prehistory, but as a central voice in re-examining humanity's ancient past. Through all these developments, one theme emerges. The stones never changed, people did. The revival is not in the dolmens themselves, but in the minds of those who now finally see them. They were waiting all along, patient as always, for a moment when curiosity would return. This rediscovery mirrors a global shift toward re-examining ancient history with new tools, new narratives, and a renewed willingness to question old assumptions. As Korean dolmens re-enter public thought, they invite people to look backward, not with nostalgia, but with wonder. And so the documentary approaches its final arc. After walking through origins, beliefs, structures, myths, and rediscovery, one question lingers still quiet, persistent, unanswered. It leads us into the last chapter, where the stones become not just objects of study, but mirrors held up to humanity itself. After centuries of weather, after dynasties rose and fell, after scholars traced patterns across maps, and archaeologists brushed dust from ancient chambers, one question remains as immovable as the stones themselves. Who were the builders? Not their names, not their tribes, not the labels later history would try to impose, but who were they, in the deepest sense? What did they believe? What did they fear? What did they hope for as they lifted stones heavier than anything their descendants would dream of moving? The dolmens offer hints, but never the full truth. Their placement suggests a people attuned to land and sky. Their construction reveals cooperation that crossed villages, valleys, and generations. Their burial goods hint at ritual, hierarchy, memory. Yet none of these clues tell us what it felt like to live in that world, what it meant to watch a capstone rise slowly into place, or to gather at dusk beside a dolmen's shadow, or to whisper a final prayer into a chamber sealed with earth. The stones preserve form, but not experience. Modern research has illuminated many pieces of the puzzle. We know the approximate dates of construction. We know the progression of styles. We understand something of their ritual roles. But these facts are scaffolding without walls. They outline the structure but leave untouched the human interior. No tool, radiocarbon dating, radar imaging, soil analysis can tell us how the builders understood their place in the cosmos, or how they interpreted the world's shifting seasons. No scientific method can recover a vanished worldview in its fullness. What makes the dolmens so haunting is that their mystery is not due to lack of effort, but due to the passage of time itself. The builders left no written texts, no carved explanations, no songs preserved through oral tradition. They entrusted their story to stone, believing perhaps that stones could speak across ages. And in a way they do. But stones speak in gestures, not sentences. They tell us what happened, not why. They tell us something mattered, not what that something was. So the central question persists. What kind of people built a landscape of memory so vast that it rivals the great megalithic traditions of the world, yet left no trace of themselves except the architecture of their devotion? Were they driven by spiritual awe, by fear of forgetting, by loyalty to ancestor spirits, by a desire to anchor themselves in a shifting world? Or were they guided by instincts we no longer possess, sensitivities to land and sky that modern life has dulled? Each theory answers part of the question, yet each theory falls short. The truth, whatever it was, remains buried beneath centuries of soil and silence. And perhaps the most honest conclusion is also the most humbling, that humans can uncover patterns, analyze artifacts, map landscapes, not but some fragments of the past resist retrieval. Some stories choose to remain in shadow. Yet there is a strange comfort in this. The unsolved mystery keeps the dolmens alive. If we fully understood everything, the stones would become objects, static and settled. Instead, they remain living questions, their silence resonant rather than empty. They invite each visitor to bring their own curiosity, to search for meaning in the spaces between supports, in the tilt of a capstone, in the alignment of a valley. They give us room to wonder, and in this wondering, we meet the builders not directly, not by name, but through the echo of intention they left behind. The unanswered question becomes a connection, a bridge across time. It reminds us that to be human is to seek meaning, even when answers do not come. Thus the documentary stands at the threshold of its final chapter. We have examined history, beliefs, patterns, science, myth, and memory. But the stones still whisper one last truth, something beyond evidence, beyond analysis, beyond even speculation. And so the narrative moves toward its closing meditation, where the dolmens reveal not just what they are, but what they reflect back at us. When we return to the dolmen fields now, after tracing their story across thousands of years, the landscape feels different. The quiet valleys, the mist-draped hills, the flat plains where capstones rest like ancient breaths, none of it has changed, yet everything has transformed. What once appeared as scattered stones now reveals itself as a tapestry of memory, woven by hands long vanished. The land is no longer just land, it is a surface engraved with human intention. Each dolmen becomes a sentence in a language we almost understand, a reminder that time does not erase everything. Some things remain, some things refuse to disappear. In the early morning, when the first light slides across the capstones, the stones seem to awaken. Dew gathers in the grooves carved by weather and centuries, reflecting the pale sky like small, trembling mirrors. Birds skim low over the fields, tracing paths that people once followed with offerings in their arms. Even the wind seems to slow as it crosses these places, as if acknowledging the weight they carry. The dolmens do not shout their meaning. They whisper it. They whisper it so softly that only those who pause long enough can hear. We imagine the builders standing here, choosing a place where land and sky met in perfect balance. They would have felt the ground beneath their feet, the grain of the soil, the pull of a distant ridge. They would have known the seasons, the migration of shadows, the shape of the wind. Their world was alive in a way we struggle to remember. They did not place stones randomly. They placed them with understanding, with intention, with a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. And perhaps that is why the dolmens endure. They were not built for spectacle. They were built for continuity. They were built to hold the memory of people who feared being forgotten and hoped their presence might stretch beyond the brief span of a single life. In their own way, these ancient communities carved themselves into the earth so the land would remember them. They trusted stone to guard what time could not. As we walk beside these monuments today, we feel the distance between then and now collapse. We sense that the hands which carried these stones were not so different from ours. They worked, they grieved, they celebrated, they wondered. Their hopes, though separated by millennia, echo through the same questions we still ask. How do we create meaning? How do we hold on to what matters? How do we face the certainty of loss? The dolmens offer no answers, yet they steady us. They remind us that the impulse to remember is ancient, that the desire to leave a trace is not new. For the builders, stone was the medium through which they spoke to the future. They could not imagine us, just as we cannot imagine who will stand where we stand now, 1,000 years from today. But they believed meaning could travel across time. And somehow, it did. As sunlight shifts and shadows lengthen, the dolmens take on different forms. At midday, they resemble great anchors, rooting the past into the present. In late afternoon, they resemble open doors, thresholds between worlds known and unknowable. At dusk, they appear almost weightless, as if the boundary between earth and sky blurs and the capstones hover in the fading light. These changes remind us that memory itself is fluid. What we understand now may not be what future generations understand. And yet the stones will remain, carrying whatever meaning each era chooses to see. The landscape, too, plays its part. Mountains stand like guardians on the horizon, watching over the fields as they did when the first dolmens were raised. Rivers continue their quiet journeys, carving new paths through old valleys. Forests grow, retreat, and grow again. Through all of this, the dolmens wait. They do not resist change, they simply endure it. Humans may come and go, but the stones remain grounded in a deeper rhythm, one measured not in centuries, but in geological breaths. Standing among the dolmens, the world slows. The noise of modern life dissolves. Even the pulse of thought grows quieter. In that stillness, the stones begin to feel less like objects and more like presences, guardians of memory, fragments of identity, silent companions to the endless passage of time. They do not demand reverence. They simply invite awareness. They ask us to notice the weight of history, the fragility of existence, and the astonishing fact that we are connected to people who lived in a world without maps, without writing, without any guarantee that their lives would be remembered. And yet, here they are. Or rather, here their intentions are, locked within the shape of each capstone, within the alignment of each chamber, within the shadow each dolmen casts across the grass. Their memory is not verbal, it is spatial. It exists in the way stones interact with sky and soil. It lives in the silence that gathers between their supports. It persists in the imagination of anyone willing to stand still and listen. In this way, the dolmens teach us something that history books often forget. That memory is not always written. It can be built, it can be shaped, it can be carved into the earth and left for strangers to find generations later. The builders may have had no idea how far their reach would extend, yet their stones continue to spark curiosity, reflection, and wonder. Their legacy is not in detailed accounts, but in the presence they left behind. As night approaches, the fields fall into shadow. Stars begin to appear above the capstones, mirroring the slow, ancient light that guided the builders long ago. It is in this twilight that the stones feel most alive. The boundary between past and present grows thin, and for a moment, the dolmens seem to breathe. They become reminders that time does not erase everything it touches. Some stories endure simply because they were carved deeply enough. And as we leave the fields, the final thought rises gently. If stones can remember us, what do we risk forgetting? The question lingers, soft yet steady, guiding the story toward its closing chapter, where the meaning we carry forward becomes the final thread in this long weave of memory and mystery. As we step back from the long arc of this story, the dolmens stand before us, not just as ancient monuments, but as reminders of something deeply human. Their age is staggering, their builders unknowable, yet the lessons they offer unfold gently, like distant echoes carried across time. In their silence, they teach us about ourselves, about the things we cherish, the fears we hide, the hopes we carve into the world, even when we suspect they may not last. These stones, raised by hands we will never meet, invite us to reflect on what it means to exist, to remember, and to be remembered. The first lesson is patience. The dolmens waited millennia for their story to be heard. They endured storms that split mountains, droughts that emptied rivers, winters so cold they cracked the earth. And through all of this, they remain steady. They remind us that history does not vanish. It drifts beneath the surface, waiting for attention, waiting for someone to pause long enough to notice. The builders did not leave us books or carved inscriptions. They left us stone chambers that required time to decode time that only later generations were willing to give. Patience, it seems, is the way the past speaks. The second lesson is humility. The dolmens reveal how fragile civilizations can be. These builders created thousands of monuments across an entire peninsula, yet their names have vanished, their languages dissolved, their rituals changed form until only stone carried their memory. Standing among the dolmens, we realize that permanence is not guaranteed by power or technology, but by the quiet persistence of intention. The builders did not know whether their monuments would endure, yet they built them anyway. This humility, this acceptance that humans are small in the face of time, rests at the heart of their legacy. The third lesson is connection. The dolmens show that ancient people were not distant abstractions, but individuals whose emotions mirrored our own. They too grieved. They too sought meaning. They too wanted their presence to reach beyond their final days. We may not understand their symbols, but we understand the impulse behind them. Every stone stands as evidence that long before written history, humans cared deeply about the bonds between generations. In this way, the dolmens bridge the gap between past and present, reminding us that our lineage stretches back through countless forgotten lives. The fourth lesson is wonder. Even with modern science, the dolmens refuse to reveal everything. Theories explain parts of their purpose, but not all. Patterns appear, but interpretations differ. This resistance to full explanation is not a frustration but a gift. Some mysteries are meant to endure. They remind us that the world we inherit is larger, older, and more intricate than we can easily grasp. In a time when information feels endless, and answers seem only a click away, the Dolmens offer the rare sensation of encountering something that cannot be fully known, and feeling peace rather than discomfort in that unknowing. Another lesson emerges quietly. Meaning does not require clarity. The Dolmens hold significance, even though their origin stories remain incomplete. They teach us that ambiguity is not emptiness. A story does not need to be fully understood to matter. In fact, some stories grow stronger because they resist definition. The megalith builders left us questions that provoke thought, stir emotion, and inspire imagination. Their silence creates space for interpretation, allowing each visitor to bring their own perspective. The meaning we feel is not accidental, it is part of the stone's enduring power. As we look across the dolmen fields today, these lessons intertwine. The stones stand beneath shifting skies, their shadows stretching long across the ground. Birds circle above. Grass sways in the wind. Nearby villages breathe with modern life, unaware of how deeply their land remembers. And yet the stones remain, grounded in the same earth that supported them thousands of years ago. They remind us that the human story is not linear. It bends, curls, disappears, and resurfaces. It survives in unexpected forms. It does not march toward clarity, it drifts toward meaning. In the quiet presence of the Dolmens, we sense that the builders understood something we often forget, that memory must be shaped, nurtured, anchored. They carved their memories into the earth, not to dominate the landscape, but to belong to it. Their monuments were expressions of relationship between people and land, life and death, past and future. Today, as we live in a world that changes faster than any before it, these stones remind us to slow down, to notice, to hold on to what matters before it slips away. As dusk settles, the sky softens into muted blue and gold. The dolmens become silhouettes, their shapes merging with the land. Shadows lengthen like quiet thoughts, stretching toward the horizon. In this moment, they seem both ancient and immediate remnants of a forgotten world and companions of the present. The light fades, but the stones remain. They have stood through countless sunsets, and they will stand through countless more. What they teach, ultimately, is that every human life leaves an imprint, even if the details vanish. The builders' names are lost, yet their presence persists. They speak to us through endurance, through stillness, through the simple act of having existed. And that is perhaps their final lesson. That meaning survives not in the completeness of a story, but in its resonance. A mystery does not weaken with time, it deepens. So the documentary ends where it began, in a landscape of stone and silence. But now the silence feels different. It no longer suggests absence, it suggests possibility. It invites imagination. It invites reflection. It invites each viewer to consider what they will leave behind, and how their own life might echo across the years. And so the story continues, not in certainty, but in the quiet, lingering space where questions remain unanswered, and meaning waits patiently to be found.